All right, well, welcome everybody. It is always so special to see faces that have become familiar. And a special welcome to everybody that's joining us via Zoom. We are excited about you being with us here this evening. Thank goodness for technology, for those of us that weren't able to make it in person. For those of you that haven't met me, my name is Dumisani Washington, and I have the privilege, the honor, as well as lots of fun of being one of the regional directors for Club Z, specifically here in Charlotte. Now, I know that us in the room are familiar with Club Z, but for the benefit of those watching that aren't, Club Z is about raising America's next generation of young Jews, and not just raising them as leaders, but raising them so that they are able to be articulate, proud, able to respond to the nuances that relate to their identity as young Jewish people, able to articulate what's going on with regards to the Middle East conflict, as well as the layers that are there, so that they're proud of who they are, not necessarily needing to be ashamed of their association with the land of Israel, or just who they are as a people. So, ladies and gents, without further ado, he is going to speak to us on the topic of Israel, Africa, and the Black Church. And as he does so, he's also going to make references to his second edition of a book that he wrote a couple of years ago, but the second edition has just been released. It's called Zionism and the Black Church. And Masha has greatly or generously agreed that, or rather, Deni Press, should I say, the entity that has published the book has generously agreed that any sales from the conversation tonight, as well as over the next week, a portion of those sales will go to Club Z. So it's a form of fundraising for us. So ladies and gents, without further ado, please welcome Pastor Dumisani Washington. They asked me to tell the people on Zoom, Pastor Dumisani is sharing a presentation which is behind us, but we are sharing the Zoom screen. So you'll be able to see what is shown here on the screen so that you don't necessarily get confused. And then from a Q&A perspective, if we can keep our questions please to the very end, then what we'll do is we'll take questions from our Zoom audience first. And once those have been addressed and it's time to say goodbye to them, we will continue with our questions and further interaction with Pastor Dumisani.
Good evening, everyone. So I move a little bit when I talk. That's just a habit, so I'm going to try to make sure I don't do that too much. So I know that they're watching online and those of you in the house here. So glad to be with you on tonight. I just met our host on today, and I want to thank you again. I don't remember all the names that I came in on, so I apologize for that first and foremost, but thank you all so much for opening this lovely home, and all the Club Z members and staff and young people. Great to be with you on tonight. I am honored to be here, not just obviously with you, but my daughter-in-law, my family here together. I didn't bring my clicker either, so it's funny. So this has been, as you can all agree, though I've not met hardly any of you, can all agree that 2020 has been a year to forget in lots of different ways. Ironically, this is probably the first event that I've done since the whole the quarantine that happened again in the spring. I can still talk. I talk too much, but I forgot was my clicker. So if you do see me do this, because I pressed the button kind of old school, right? So I just remember I sit down. Oh, they want me to sit down. That's no problem. Now if I jump up, it's because I get excited. That's not right. I apologize. So I hope this is okay. Am I okay? Is that better? Yeah, no, I'm getting coaching from off stage, so I'm kind of just making sure that everything is okay. While they're doing that, again, I'm honored to be here with you tonight. This is not my first Club Z event. My first Club Z event in Charlotte, North Carolina, but your esteemed fearless leader, Masha. I'm always messing with Masha's last name. We've known Masha. Actually, I met Masha 6 years ago now, a little bit more than 6, almost 7 years ago, at San Jose State University, which is a long story in and of itself. I won't get into all of that, but I met her before. I guess Club Z started around that time. It's about 8 years. Okay, so I was meeting her around that time. She was getting me started. Philip, her oldest, I believe. I think he was junior high at that time or whatever. So it's just been a little while. Time goes by really quickly. And we became friends, and so we've known each other for a while, and again, out there in California. I want to do this talk and share with you about the book. It's not so much talking the book, it's just the book just happens to be about the title. So I said, oh, sure, we have the book. And yes, we have kind of joined together that we can share some of the proceeds of the book on today and going forward with Club Z. The name of the book is Zionism in the Black Church. Come back to that in a second. And it is done by the press and my family. It's kind of, that's my family there. They used to take that picture with me because I was traveling all the time. So they're mostly here, but I like the picture anyway. So I showed a picture of my family. It's grown since then. My oldest daughter, I won't take the time to point out, just got married a couple of weeks ago. So the new son-in-law is not in there yet. And then Olga's going to have another child. So I have to take another family picture to add all this on there. So we hopefully get everybody on the screen. But yes, that's my lovely wife is here. I'm so glad she's able to be with us on tonight as well. Dumisani Press is the name of the company, our family's company that actually produces the book, publishes the book, which will be out in about a month. So you can pre-order it. And just like a quick little shameless plug, there's also a children's book that's coming out in February. Go on to it. All right, and you go to dumisanipress.com if you want to get more information on that. You'll see it there. There are 6 chapters in this book. It's a second edition, and it is something of a labor of love. This is just something that was just on my heart to do. Give a little background about me. I started an organization called the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel in 2013. I started it shortly after my first trip to Israel, which was in December 2012. I went as part of the African American Pastors Tour with Christians United for Israel. I'm now a staff member with Christians United for Israel. I was not on staff at the time. I had friends who were part of it. And I had I could only explain was a very deeply moving and spiritual experience for myself, with a strong sense to come back to the States and do 2 things. Number one, do all that I could to strengthen both the Africa-Israel Alliance and the Black and Jewish community. Again, I won't get into all the details, that would take a long time itself, but suffice to say that I had a sense to do it and not really an understanding of how I was going to do it. That eventually turned into the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel. I am no longer over that. My son Joshua is now the executive director of that organization. And in writing this book happened maybe several months after that. And what I want to do is share with you just a little bit of each chapter in our talk here, and we can kind of discuss together. You'll see there that each of the chapters in some way deals with what this theme is tonight, Israel and Africa, and the Jewish and Black communities. And so in writing it, over a period of time, in the second edition, now 7 years later after the first edition, each chapter has been expanded, has been more detailed, as a matter of fact, I'm working with my editors now, I'm finishing, and things are happening so quickly in the media, which we'll touch on here in a moment, that I go back into I just had a session this morning when they said, Pastor Dumisani, you have to stop editing. You can't keep adding things. We're never going to be finished editing the book. Because every week in the news, something else is going on where Israel is concerned, where the Jewish community and the Black community is concerned. You've had the protests that happened after the George Floyd killing in Minnesota. And some of you are aware, some of you may not be aware, but there's been a sub-theme underneath that has been a great deal of activity, even tension between the Black and Jewish community. And the media has focused on some of it, but not really. And this has been something near to my heart. So I go to the chapters and I start writing and realize that you have to finish writing. So if you see something in the book, you say, hey, we're getting into this. Well, we were trying to finish writing. That's why we couldn't get to it. So I want to start from the beginning. Let's do this here. Chapter 1 is the African biblical title of Israel. What I simply did was just get a quote so I can just kind of base it for somewhere for you. Here, when we talk about Africa, Israel, you are talking about Israel's most ancient foreign relationship. Easily. This is just scripture. Now, I'm a pastor. I'm not going to start preaching. There's a piano. I'm a musician as well, so I won't do all the singing and the preaching and everything. But please understand that what I'm sharing with you right now, I share with pastors all over the country, especially with our African pastors. I'm the National University Outreach Coordinator for CUFI, which is at over 9.5 million members, the largest pro-Israel organization in the country, probably in the world. And it's also the most diverse. I have the privilege of working with Christians who are Native American, Hispanic, African, African American, you name it, throughout the entire multi-ethnic spectrum. I have the privilege of doing this and traveling across the country. And when I'm talking to African pastors, with no comparison at all, not in any way making some sort of value judgment, there is a resonance that's there. If you've never been to an African night to honor Israel, you've never really seen an Israel celebration. And that is in no way a denigration to the many Israel celebrations I've been to. I'm talking about the singing and the dancing and the declarations. And I can only surmise that, in my limited understanding, that much of that deep, deep passion comes from a relationship that's thousands of years old. And I can point to many examples in the scripture. I'll just point to one. I'll read from this quote. It says, the Queen of Sheba traveled to Jerusalem to visit King Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 10. In the Ethiopian historical record called the Kebra Nagas, Glory of the Kings, this queen was Makeda, who reigned in Axum. It was this very queen and this journey that Jesus referenced in one of his sermons 1,000 years later. And again, this is just one of many references. But one of the reasons why I mentioned this in the book, both in the first chapter and I believe also later on when we come to another Zionist section in the 4th chapter, is because it is the first foreign dignitary that the kingdom of Israel ever receives, and the only one that receives this narrative. Solomon, as you know, was the 3rd king of Israel, right? You have Saul, you have David, you have Solomon. No foreign nation ever comes to Israel and does anything like Ethiopia does. Blesses the Jewish people, blesses the God of Israel. She brings a tribute that includes 4 tons of gold. This is a very wealthy nation. This is not a USA for Africa type of situation. There's no poverty. There's no famine in Ethiopia. This is the ancient times, and Africa and Egypt are doing very well. Thank you very much. Very wealthy. So she's not coming because Solomon is wealthy. She's coming because she's heard of his wisdom. And when she comes, she's so impressed. She commends him for his administration, but then she does something very strange in that text. She goes, blessed be the God of Israel who loves Israel forever, and that's why he's made you king. She gives her praise and glory and honor to God. She's actually acknowledging the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And this relationship is forged here. It is never again in the scriptures do we ever read about any other foreign king that makes any kind of incursion into Israel is to kill the Jewish people. Is to destroy. You never read about this type of synergy. This is what I call the first Africa-Israel alliance. The first Africa-Israel summit happens right there in the scriptures. This is how far back Africa and Israel's relationship goes. Some of you are also aware of the Kebra Nagas, which is the historical record of the Ethiopian people. There is a legend that Solomon and Sheba had a child together by the name of Melon Waverly. I can't see you online if you're able. Waverly, you ever heard that legend before? So some of you, there's a legend that they actually had a child named Melanet. And the Ethiopians, many believe this, some don't believe, but many believe this, that part of the royal line, of the Davidic royal line, that actually reigned on the throne. Haile Selassie was the last royal emperor of Ethiopia. He reigned from 1930 to 1974, and they called him the Lion of Judah based on that royal lineage. The Rastafarian religion comes from a worship of Haile Selassie. This is how far back this actually goes. This is where this comes from. Now, whether the legend is correct or not, that's not what I'm here to say. What I am here to say is that it's based on a historical record that goes back 3,000 years ago. Again, Africa, Israel. This is the ancient part of the relationship. Chapter 2. I'm going to read just this quote here. And the title of this chapter is The Jewish Diaspora and the Prophetic Return to Israel. Again, you'll see this Africa-Israel weaving here. There are countless testimonies of God's miracle working power within the saga of the Ethiopian Aliyah, immigration or return to their homeland in Israel. In 2013, I had the honor of interviewing Ms. Penina Tamano-Shaka, Israel's newly appointed Aliyah and Integration Minister. Penina was part of Operation Moses, 1984, Israel's secret airlift of the Ethiopian Jews who crossed the border into Sudan. I will never forget what she shared with me about her story. And I'm going to give you a little insight in what she shared in a moment. You'll see again this Africa-Israel connection, both the ancient and then obviously the modern. And one of the many of the Jewish people returning, I should say, the communities of the Jewish people returning to the land.
being the Ethiopian Jews. Okay, we've ever heard of Operation Solomon, Operation Moses, right? It's amazing. You have Jewish people who return to the land from all over the world. But that story has been, I guess, the Red Sea Diving Resort has just made a movie earlier this year, I believe it was. Again, this story has captured the hearts and imaginations of so many people, non-Jewish people, because of just the impossibility of it, if you will. These people who have been in Ethiopia, once again, nearly 3,000 years, longing for Zion, the same story of Jews throughout the diaspora longing to return. One of the things I love about the Jewish tradition, when many of you do traditional weddings, you destroy the glass, right? And it's a symbol of the temple having been destroyed. That even in the midst of the joy, when my Jewish friends explained to me, that's so deep here, we're rejoicing, we're celebrating, but the temple was destroyed, and we are remembering that we are a people either in exile or at the very least had been dispersed, even in the midst of a joyous celebration. Same thing with the Ethiopian Jews there in Ethiopia. Here, Panina Tamonashata, and I had to get the opportunity to interview her through a good Israeli friend. We were on the phone, and she told me about Operation Moses from her. So now I've heard many of these stories. I recorded this one in the book. I'll share this one with you. Just don't tell anybody, make them read the book, okay? So she explained how, again, if you see the Sudan, during this time in the 80s, there was a very, very oppressive government in Ethiopia that was very systematically oppressing the Jewish people. Again, the same thing. Here, these are Black Jews in Ethiopia, but they're going through the same type of oppression that Jews would have gone through in Spain and Portugal and in Germany. Again, it's the same thing. They even call them the word Palasha. Have you ever heard that before? It means outsider. It means you're not from here. You might look like me, but you're not from here. We know that you're not from here. They called them Buddha, evil eye. They said they were good with money. They could control weather. You ever heard those things before? This is the exact same thing. Somebody from outside would think, oh, these are just Ethiopians. No, these are Jews. These are non-Jews. This is anti-Semitism right here. So what happens during this time, the Jews are fleeing, and the Israeli government has already begun to work secretly with some of the leaders to airlift them from nearby Sudan. Sudan, who is still an enemy with Israel. Isn't it amazing we see in the news that Sudan is talking about normalizing relations? Sudan has been an enemy with Israel ever since 1948, the Jewish state, but after 1967, the cartoon nose are named for the capital of Sudan. No peace with Israel, no negotiations with Israel, no, what's the third one? Tell me the third one. No recognition of Israel, thank you. That was there at Khartoum, the Arab League. So Sudan is an enemy nation. So you have Ethiopians going into the border, crossing the border of Sudan, and they are coordinating with the Mossad and the IDF for them to swoop down in the middle of the night and pick them up and take them into Israel. The same thing that Israel did with Operation Magic Carpet in Yemen with the Yemeni Jews. Once again, Israel fighting wars of existentialism, and at the same time bringing in refugees from around the world. We call it a miracle. Well, Panina and her father and several of her siblings are there in Sudan. Please understand too, during this thing, I'll just say this real quickly, some 4,000 Ethiopian Jews perished in this time of several years of going, 4,000. Israel honors their memory every year in Jerusalem Day in June. While they're celebrating the reunification of Jerusalem, they're remembering the 4,000 Ethiopian Jews who died trying to reach Zion. So Panina is a little girl. They're there in Sudan. And sure enough, here comes the IDF. They put them onto the trucks and then take them to the Hercules plane. She has a big family, mother, father, maybe 4 or 5 siblings. Her father and a couple of her siblings got on one truck, her mother and a couple of other siblings on another truck, and they're going to the plains in the dead of night. They get on the plane, they get on, but they don't know that their mother's truck has broken down. So they all get on a plane. They can't tell them because they can't endanger the mission. They fly to Israel, they touch down, everybody's celebrating, and mom and sisters are still in Sudan. The Mossad and the IDF looked for them for a year and found them and reunited them in Israel. She told me this, I'm getting chills now. When she tells me the story, I'm listening to an interpreter. And I'm like, I'm getting emotional. It was such an amazing thing. It's a story of heroism of the Ethiopian Jews and the relentlessness of the Israeli government to bring the people of Israel home. And this is one of the things we talk about in this chapter. Stories like this and this amazing thing that particularly Christians need to know in standing with Israel and the Jewish people. Chapter 3. This part here starts to go further into the Black Jewish community. The Negro spirituals about Moses that my people go in Joshua fits the Battle of Jericho, are inspirational songs about the Israelites' victory over their enemies. They are musical stories about God's miraculous works on behalf of his people. Moses was the brave leader who stood up to Pharaoh. Joshua was the warrior who led Israel to victory in the promised land. The Israelites are the ultimate underdog, something Black folk have identified with since being dispossessed in Africa and sold as chattel slavery throughout the New World. For the Black slave, Zion became synonymous with freedom. Now, I hope I'm making this connection for you that Africans didn't become aware of the Israelite story when they came to the New World. Remember, all those things happened after, right? Sinai is Egypt, right? All these things happened there. So they're well aware, but now this story takes on a whole nother level because like the Israelites who are enslaved, so are African Americans enslaved. And like their longing to be free, one of the greatest abolitionists was a young lady by the name of Harriet Tubman. One of her nickname for her was Moses. They called her Moses or Black Moses. Why? Because there was all of these allusions to the Israelite story from bondage to freedom. These songs were sung on slave plantations, not just as encouragement songs, but also as code songs. They would use these songs to coordinate when they were going to meet at certain places in the dead of night, going on their way through the Underground Railroad. And so the Jewish people and Zionism became synonymous with freedom, became synonymous with being freed from slavery. This is part of the ethos of the Black American tradition as far back as the 1600s. Now you see a connection in the New World, but on a different level. Chapter 4 is the Dr. King portion of it. Often, this is discussed when we talk about the civil rights movement and the disproportionate role that the Jewish community played in that movement. Dr. King said himself, there's been no other ethnic group more represented in the Negro's struggle for justice than the Jew. But it's important in the book that we try to make them understand that that didn't just start during the civil rights movement. That didn't just start with Abraham Heschel and Dr. King marching together in Selma, but this starts long before, and I won't mention, you'll see a little bit of it, but it's amazing that part of what we talk about in the book is the relationship shortly after the 20th century begins and after slavery between, I'm gonna ask this, I'll do this like a classroom thing. Raise your hand if you ever heard of the relationship between Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald. All right, there's no test afterwards or anything like that. This was actually the beginning of the synergy post-slavery. Booker T. Washington, known as one of our founding fathers, if you will, post-slavery, writes a book called Up from Slavery. He's the founder of the Tuskegee Institute. He writes that book. Julius Rosenwald of Sears Roebuck fame, he actually took the company and made it the millions that it became, he and his partner. He had a huge philanthropic heart, deep within the Jewish tradition. As a matter of fact, his rabbi in Chicago was Emil Hirsch, one of the Jewish founders of NAACP. And he encouraged Julius Rosenwald in his philanthropy where the Black community was concerned. Julius Rosenwald reads Booker T. Washington's book. He's floored, he wants to meet him. They talk, and Booker T. Washington asks him, would he be interested in help funding schools throughout the segregated South because Black people are free, but there's still not a huge move in terms of education, right? Even within the abolitionist movement, many of them said, okay, slaves are free, we're done, we're gonna go home now. And literally, you had a literacy rate that was almost 100%. Why? Because it was illegal to teach slaves to read. It was the Black-Jewish relationship between Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington that actually turned the course of history in this nation. So the Black-Jewish relationship in this nation starts long before Dr. King, but it explodes again during the Civil Rights Movement. Dr. King was such a Zionist. Edward Said, a Palestinian-American professor and anti-Israel activist, said in 1993, with the emergence of the Civil Rights Movement in the middle 60s, and particularly in the 66 to 67, I was very soon turned off by Martin Luther King, who revealed himself to be a tremendous Zionist and who always used to speak very warmly in support of Israel, particularly in 67 after the war. I didn't choose the Dr. King quote because, I mean, there's a lot of quotes there in the book, but let me suffice to say, when Israel's enemies hate you because you're a Zionist, you're probably a Zionist. When Israel, long after he's dead, Dr. King was assassinated in 1968. 1993, one of Israel's staunch enemies on the college campuses here, who's just poisoning the minds of kids from all over. He writes in his own memoirs that he was cool with Dr. King's civil rights thing, but that Jewish thing was just, oh, that's what really bothered him. And again, Dr. King was proud of that. He stood firmly in solidarity with Israel and the Jewish people and warned about the anti-Semitism that he saw that was burgeoning, which leads us here. This is the longest chapter in the book. And I only have an hour and a half more. I'm just kidding. This was the most difficult chapter, particularly for the second edition, because we're having to speak truth to where we actually are. I'll read this quote. Arguably the most effective form of Soviet anti-Zionist deception and propaganda targeting the Black community was embodied by the Egyptian-born, self-proclaimed leader of the Arab Palestinian people. His name was Mohammed Yasser Abdel Rahman Abdel Rauf Arafat Abda al-Husseini, better known as Yasser Arafat, leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization. And this is the quote from a former KGB agent. The KGB had a penchant for liberation movements. The Palestine Liberation Organization, the National Liberation Army of Colombia, and the National Liberation Army of Bolivia were just a few of the liberation movements born at the KGB. I'll say this as succinctly as I can. The anti-Zionism that has found its way into Black justice movements, and let me say this first of all, this is in no way saying that the Black community by and large is anti-Zionist or anti-Semitic. It's not true. It has never been true. What's unfortunate is some of the loudest voices in the Black community are rabidly anti-Israel, rabidly anti-Semitic, and they rarely get pushed back. This is where the problem is. It's like me telling my Jewish friends, the vast majority of Jewish people in the United States are pro-Israel. There may be different sides of the political spectrum for pro-Israel, but I've seen myself, and you can attest to, that some of in the Jewish community who are very anti-Israel have loud voices and big platforms, and they give the impression that somehow are speaking for this is exactly what's happening here. And unfortunately, media plays a huge role in this. And yes, this chapter talks about Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam, the Black Lives Matter organization. Let me pause here. The vast many of people in Black Lives Matter are not, they don't even know what their charter says, but it says it, and its leaders are extremely committed to anti-Zionist propaganda. People get frustrated when I say it. I'll give you a tissue. It's just true. It's true. And this is why this is what this, no, it's actually in their manifesto, and it's very clear. After the protests of George Floyd, there was a lot of anti-Israel, anti-Semitic incidents that happened. One of the worst ones was the Fairfax area of Los Angeles, where there were Jewish people themselves. One rabbi described it as a pogrom. And who led it? Black Lives Matter in Los Angeles. The media will not deal with it. And you know what? As an African-American, I'm very used to the media not dealing with my community. So you know what? Our community has to speak truth. The rabbi said it was like Kristallnacht, over 5 synagogues defaced, yeshivas, stores, purposely, intentionally. What does that have to do with justice for George Floyd? Absolutely nothing. But this is what was creeping in during the 60s. And unfortunately, it has gained much traction, which is another reason for this book. I say this here as I'm finished this last chapter. People often ask me, why are you so passionate about this? Well, raised as a Christian and in my home and in the Black church tradition and all of those things, but the passion intensified as I just not only understood the biblical understanding of bless those who bless you in the scriptures, but when I saw the connection between the Black and Jewish communities, the Africa-Israel alliance, and I saw how my community was being manipulated to, almost in the words of Dr. King, come against the very community that has been the most faithful in standing with us. So I took it personally, because just like destroying a Jewish neighborhood does nothing to get justice for George Floyd, So that attitude continues to make things work for my community. Not only does it not get justice, it actually makes things worse. How do you fight racism? By upholding anti-Semitism. How do you come against racism? By denouncing Zionism. You don't. And this was started in the 60s. I tell this story about Eldridge Cleaver, the Minister of Information of the Black Panthers, who was a rabid anti-Zionist. He was caught up in some legal stuff. He fled the United States. His first stop was to Cuba because he was convinced that Marxists were his friends. And the Castro brothers treated him worse than the CIA. He said himself, they followed him everywhere he left. He fled and went to Algeria, where he saw African slaves. He had never seen it before. Blew him away. He lived in exile for 7 years, came back a Zionist. The first interview he gave was to the Jewish Telegraph. And he went telling his colleagues, we have it all wrong. The Jews are not why we are, Zionists are not our problem. And those stories get buried because they don't fit in narrative. This is another reason why the book exists. Last one. Chapter 6 talks about why there's hope and the reason for it. I'll read this last quote. It's actually from Dr. Carter Woodson, the writer of the book called The Miseducation of the Negro from 1933. The mere imparting of information is not education. Above all things, the effort must result in making a man think and do for himself, just as the Jews have done in spite of universal persecution. We make the case in the book that the reason for a growing anti-Semitism within certain sectors of the Black community is chiefly a lack of education, disinformation. And so if that's the case, there has to be an effort to give what I call authentic education, real history, to truly understand where we are and how we got here, to truly understand what needs to happen in terms of there just not being a synergy, but for us to actually stand on the side of justice. There's many stories, and I'll end with this one. I use as an example a huge piece of African-American history that's rarely taught, or when it is, it's often distorted. And that is, last question for the class, how many of you ever heard of the Tulsa Black Wall Street? Okay, a couple people. So in 1921, there was a race riot in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a white on Black massacre that destroyed this Black town, completely obliterated it, burned everything to the ground. It was called Negro Wall Street by Booker T. Washington because it was like our Jewish friends, it was a community that because of segregation, because of ghettoizing, it was a community that was raised by Black families and business, people who were not even 50 years removed from slavery. It starts in the 19-teens. There's some sort of race issue that happens with the nearby white town. This town gets destroyed. And most African-American young people know one of two things about that story, either nothing or that it was destroyed by white racists in 1921. It's not even close to half of the story. The entire town is rebuilt in less than 2 years. And when it's rebuilt, it's more prosperous and wealthy. I'm talking now, this is business, oil barons, landowners, factory owners, manufacturers, you name it, it's in this town. It's part of the jealousy that actually happened. It was just like our Jewish friends, it's amazing. They were saying that we recognize that some of the Jewish hospitals that exist, they exist because they couldn't practice medicine with the Gentiles. Not because they were not wanting to be with non-Jews, but because they said, no, yeah, we don't care if you're a doctor. We don't care if you're an architect. You go over there. And that's exactly what happened with the Black community. It was rebuilt, but not only that, before they rebuilt it, the county of Tulsa tried to steal the land from the Black landowners. They passed this ordinance that all the new buildings had to have new fire codes, which was this code for saying, we're gonna make it so expensive for you to rebuild. We're gonna take your land. And they were so happy about it, the paper was actually printing what they were gonna do with the land when they took it. 2 Black attorneys from Black Wall Street represented the entire group, fought it all the way, won it in the county, and the county protested, and they went all the way to the state Supreme Court, won both cases, and they rebuilt in the land, and it prospered until the 1960s. Why am I telling you that story? Part of their inspiration was what the Jewish people had to do all this time. They were inspired by that. So when you see not only blaming Jews for things like police brutality, do you know that one of the things out there is they're telling that the reason why George Floyd died is because Israel trains American police and they teach them to be racist. This is what's actually being said. And people who don't know anything else, like, well, they blame Israel for George Floyd's murder and Breonna Taylor and Sidham. This is the insanity that's happening, but it's based on a lack of education. Hence where we are now. And an African-American young person understanding something like that about their history and how part of the inspiration is what we saw our Jewish brothers and sisters do who lost everything. One of the things that we're able to do with Kufi is start what's called the Mizrahi Project. It's a story about the 850,000 Jewish refugees from North Africa and the Middle East who fled their lands, particularly after the state of Israel was reborn, who lost everything. Our Iraqi Jewish friends who left with a briefcase and a little sack, and that's all that they could carry, businesses and homes and everything. And we built, most of them fleeing to Israel, some of them to the UK and to the United States. And whenever we show that film to Black students and Native American students, and they see it, they're amazed. Number one, they never heard the story before. They know only a little bit in terms of what happened to our Jewish brothers and sisters in Europe after the Holocaust. So they're watching it, and when they see that, they go, my God, they rebuilt. And in the film, each of the short films, they hear each of these as Mizrahi Jewish people say, we didn't hold on to bitterness. We had to move forward. We had to build, which is exactly what the Black Americans had to do. This is another reason why the book exists. And we're hoping, praying to God, that it has the effect on the Black community, particularly for the young people. So I'm gonna stop talking there and take it from the questions, all right? Good. Yeah. I was trying to be so cognizant of the time. I didn't want to talk too much. She gave me a time limit and everything, and I was trying to make sure that was in it. She asked me to have more. I can talk on that. Seriously, I can. I will say this last thing, and then Olga, I'll turn it to you here. When I tell that story in the end, for example, I was with my editors just today, right? And we are in chapter 5, or chapter 5, going into chapter 6, and we had a discussion about Tulsa's Black Wall Street. And neither of them really knew the story either. And they paused. It was one of the reasons why it's taking so long to edit the book. And we started having these deep discussions. And they said, okay, let's finish so we can get the book out. As they began to discuss it, the further we go in the editing process, the more it's having this effect on them. And this is what my prayer is. See, a Black synergy with Israel and the Jewish people means nothing if that young man or young woman still thinks of themselves as less than, right? How can I stand in solidarity with you if I think that I'm less than, right? How can I actually support you if I feel so unworthy of life being good to me, right? Because that's only going to last for a certain period of time. At some point, jealousy, anger, frustration based on me having to do me. This is part of what is actually happening here. This is part of where we are in this moment in time. This is one of the reasons why, as I share with my Jewish friends a lot, that the education piece is the most important one, because even someone who considers themselves a supporter of Israel, when I encounter anti-Semitism and I deal with the Black community, it's so not a political thing. I've met as many Black conservative anti-Semites as I have Black liberal anti-Semites. It's amazing, and it's all based on the same thing, a lack of understanding. They may consider, well, we're not liberals, so this is how we feel about the Jewish people. Then they'll say something extremely anti-Semitic. Well, those Jews are good with money. It's like, well, that's just, and the liberals, same thing. All those Black conservatives, blah, blah, blah. I found that it's an issue. It doesn't matter which camp. One may be a little bit more vocal, but it's still there. But it's based on the same thing, a lack of understanding of history. This is one of the reasons why this is so important for us here. I wrote the book with that in mind, but knowing also that our Jewish friends may want to read it as well and see some things. And there they may even be helpful for you. So I'll stop there.
All right, from our Zoom audience, the first question that we have for you, Pastor Dumisani, is, why is it that BLM leaders are louder than the voices of Zionist African Americans? How can this be changed?
There are several reasons why this is the case. One of the reasons why is because I'll go back to the first one, lack of education. Okay, so when BLM says George Floyd was killed because of Israeli police, and they give all these false statistics because, some of you don't know, Israel has been training police from all over the world ever since 9/11. Why? Because it's the best at counterterrorism. As a matter of fact, a few years ago, Kasim Reed, the African-American mayor of Atlanta, was protested by BLM there because they wanted him to stop allowing the police to train with Israeli police. And he says, I refuse to do so. He said, they are the best at counterterrorism, and that relationship is benefiting us. So if somebody hears the attack and they didn't know that Israel was actually training police, then they may be inclined to believe the rest of it, right? Because they don't have the information. That's the first thing. The second reason, Olga, and I can last for now, intimidation, right? Because again, you get on social media, you get on Twitter, you hear these different things, and you hear things, and you are afraid to push back, either because you don't know the real information, or because it seems like everybody is in agreement, right? Everybody is okay with this, right? They're saying these things about Israel, okay, and this wasn't part of the question, let me answer this way too. Part of the encouragement to turn a blind eye to it, can I, all my Jewish friends in the room here, are Jewish brothers and sisters who make excuses for BLM thinking that you're doing something for my community. I help you, you're not. You're not. You can stand in solidarity with the African-American community. You can speak out against injustice, and you can still do that and say, but when BLM says X, Y, Z, this is anti-Semitic. You do no one any favors, your community or mine, by acting like. Some of the most pushback I get is some of my young people, oh, don't say that, Pastor Dumisani. Don't say what? The truth? Well, don't say they changed. That's how they were, but they changed. They have not changed. They came out with their manifesto in August of 2016. It's on their website right now. I can give you all the places to click. They try to bury it, right? Click on this, click on this, click on this, open up this PDF file. Israel is an apartheid state. Israel committing genocide against the Palestinians. They're saying the same thing Hamas says, right? So the question becomes, how does that help me? How does that help me as an African American? It doesn't. So acting like it's not there doesn't help, and that's why. So everybody else agrees that this is not going on, but it actually is. So you don't want to be the person, right? You know, well, okay, I'm not racist. You have to start that whole thing like that. Okay, you know when the person starts the statement, I'm not an anti-Semite, the next thing that's coming out, right, exactly, right? So I'm not racist, but I just want to say, so that's the thing, they put you on the defensive, right? So you have to say is that, you have to defend the fact you're not racist. You are concerned. I'll never forget this. I met a Ghanaian pastor in Washington, D.C., several years ago at one of the Washington, D.C. summits for CUFI. And we were in the lobby just kind of talking. And he was there talking about what he does. He's a city planner based in D.C., but he also does a lot of work in Ghana. And he has this huge, seminar that he does in Ghana each year. And he takes American students with him to go and be volunteers. He puts out an all points bulletin. He just lets people know, he posted in the chat rooms and stuff like that. He lets all the young people know, whoever wants to come, who wants to help. He said, Pastor Dumisani, do you know the group that overwhelmingly volunteers every single time? I said, gee, let me guess. He said, Jewish girls, especially Jewish girls. He said, I don't know why. He said, I don't say, hey, Jewish people, come out. He said, I just say anybody. And Washington, D.C. is about as black a town as you can get, right? It's always over. He said, so whenever we have our end of the, time that we're actually there in my seminar, he says, it's like an Israel rally. So, because there's Jewish students all over the room. And he said, but it's just because they always are the ones who volunteer. Again, if there's one ethnic group that doesn't have to defend its legacy of anti-racism, it would be the Jewish people. So it's okay to say, hey, I stand in solidarity with my black brothers and sisters, but when BLM says this is just not right. And let the chips fall in there. I'm kind of a rebel like that, but I'm sorry, next question.
All right, so our next question, and apparently I'm not that audible, so please read.
Oh, yes, ma'am. Oh, say this.
How can we bring back to the Black community what MLK Jr. believed in and the partnership that we used to have between the Jewish and Black communities?
I'll say it again. The first and foremost thing is education. This is the part for my Jewish brothers and sisters that you can help by davening for us and being a part of those types of organizations. But the reality of it is, when I mean organizations, I mean in terms of particular education is concerned, there are things that we, and I'm not saying some sort of paternalistic way, my people are extremely capable, right? We have done, we've survived. But unfortunately, when it comes to this particular area and others, there's been a lot of disinformation, right? Decades of disinformation. So there has to be, first and foremost, a relearning of things, both African-American history and then our history when it comes to our relationship with the Jewish people. So it has to be that first and foremost.
Okay, and what appears to be our last one from everybody following on Zoom is, why do you think that the BLM leadership found it necessary to include Israel in their manifesto?
That, you know what, the book I touch on, but I can only surmise. I have some strong opinions, but let me venture not go to there. What I will tell you is that two things. Number one, there's a long history. In chapter 5 of this book that deals with anti-Zionism and Israel history and Israel hatred, the reason why I did that Yasser Arafat quote, it wasn't just to single him out. There was a systematic, repetitive attempt to focus on the Black civil rights leaders. When Dr. King spoke in defense of Israel and the Jewish people, he wasn't just saying, I love the Jewish people. He was actually pushing back on what was a burgeoning anti-Semitism within the Black community, something people had really never seen before. He was actually asked about it. That effort has been relentless. For the last 50 plus years, there has been media disinformation, political disinformation that has attempted to pit the Jewish community and the Black community and the Jewish community against each other. This is what's happening now. In New York right now, not a day goes by, there's not an attack of someone who's either part of a Black Hebrew Israelite group or a Louis Farrakhan member who's attacking a Jewish person. It's not talked about in the media because it doesn't fit the narrative. It's happening right now. Bedford Stiles, you name it. They see someone who looks obviously Jewish, someone from the Hasidic community, whatever, and they're being talked about, spit on, beat up. This wasn't going on during Dr. King's day. This was unheard of in the Black community. It is the lack of information that's there. This has been going on for a while. BLM is following a long tradition. I'll say this. This is nothing new under the sun. There's a picture of Yasser Arafat and Eldridge Cleaver in Algeria holding their hands up together in solidarity. I didn't bring a picture of 1979 of Yasser Arafat and Jesse Jackson in the West Bank hugging and smiling. Yasser Arafat knew exactly what he was doing. We call it blaxploitation. He knew exactly every opportunity he got with a photo op with a Black leader. Pictures are amazingly powerful things. And some in the Black community saw that if you were truly for justice, you were on the side of the oppressed Palestinians, knowing nothing about what was really going on. BLM is part of that woke justice tradition. They're wrong, just like they were wrong 50 years ago. And this is why it has to be pushed back in terms of education.